for welcome to such a warm worshiping community, and I really appreciate especially Kathleen and Reverend Kate and others who have made me prepared for this moment. So I'm very, very pleased to be with you all. I've known y'all for years, even though this is my first time being able to preach for y'all. I started coming to P-Town as a kid back in the early 90s, and coming to visit from Tennessee, this was the first UU church I ever attended. And so your theological openness and commitment to unconditional welcome rather than judgment stuck with me, even back then. It was my first glimpse of the possibility that one could be both religious and socially progressive. And that was a breath of fresh air for this southern tween. Now, a couple of decades later, just a couple, it's such a privilege and such a joy to get to worship with you all here this morning, still celebrating those same commitments to theological openness and unconditional welcome. Spirit of life and love, which moves through us and through all the world. May we be grateful this day for the gift of life that is ours in all its beauty and its difficulty. May we this day be reminded of the responsibilities we carry to ourselves, to one another, to our community, and to wider society. We remember these ripples of influence not so that we are intimidated or overwhelmed, but so that we might be true to them, and so that we might be faithful and bearing witness to the peace that is possible. May we this day maintain a sense of perspective, remembering who we are, engaging with the tasks at hand, but understanding our limitations and shortcomings so that we might forgive ourselves and others if any should fall short of perfection. May we this day be inspired, filled with new breath, filled with new enthusiasm, and ready to see fresh perspectives and possibilities, unnoticed avenues for action and delight. And may we remember the virtues that bless our lives and the ways we can be a blessing to others. The virtues of caring and concern, the virtues of honesty and respect, and the virtues of creativity, charity, and love. May we all feel called to do the good work of making this world a more just, equitable, and loving place for all creatures. Amen. Our reading this morning is from the Christian tradition, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "What's written in the law? What do you read there?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "Okay. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by the other side. But when a Samaritan was traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, having poured out oil and wine on them. And then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The scripture I read from the Gospel of Luke is perhaps one of the most well-known stories in the whole of the Bible. One doesn't have to grow up being a Christian tradition to hear the phrase Good Samaritan, meaning one who helps someone in need. In fact, the story of the Good Samaritan is so familiar that there are a whole set of legal principles in countries all around the globe named for this particular teaching of Jesus. Have you heard of these, the Good Samaritan laws? You've heard of them, right? Well, Good Samaritan laws exempt from legal liability anyone who comes to another person's aid and reasonably tries to help if they're injured, ill, or otherwise in peril. So say, for example, that you're having brunch at a restaurant, which I hope to do very soon, maybe up the street at Cafe Heaven, and someone starts choking on their pancakes. If you go over and assist them with the Heimlich maneuver to free the offending flapjack, but in the process end up breaking their rib, they cannot sue you for assault and battery. After all, you are being a good Samaritan, someone who assists someone in need. The story of the Good Samaritan is what's known as a parable, or a situation in which Jesus is trying to teach something to someone using a narrative. In his earthly ministry, sometimes Jesus spoke very clearly. There wasn't much mistaking when he said things like, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must leave everything behind and follow me." But at other times, and actually quite frequently, Jesus spoke in these parable stories instead, stories whose meanings were open to interpretation. This is what I find so funny about those who claim the Bible should be read literally and should be free from any human interpretation, because that mentality is directly at odds with how Jesus himself taught his followers in stories that offered glimpses of truth rather than clear-cut answers. So given Jesus' own invitation for us to do so, how should one interpret his parable of the Good Samaritan for these modern times? I have to admit, I wrote 2 sermons this week. The first went something like this. In today's scripture, a legal expert stands up and questions Jesus on the law. He's already rightly answered him that the 2 most important commandments in the ancient Jewish law, the 2 principles on which all other Jewish laws were built, were love God and love your neighbor. 2 simple rules of holy living according to the law. But leave it to a lawyer to complicate things. He isn't content with those 2 simple commandments, and so he asks for further clarification. The lawyer asks, yes, but who then is my neighbor? Seems a simple question. But here's the problem with that question. Implied within it is a second one. Then who is not my neighbor? And that's what the lawyer was really asking. He's asking Jesus for the boundaries of the neighborhood. Who's in? Who's out? Because knowing that will define who the lawyer has to love to follow God's law. He's asking Jesus for a bare minimum. And though that might sound to us like a bad question, the lawyer meant it in earnest, right? After all, at that time, religious Israelites like him were insular folks, living in tight-knit communities for both safety and religious custom. They interacted with the wider world only so much as it was necessary. They were a group with their own laws, their own culture, and these clearly defined who was in their neighborhood and who was not. But Jesus offers that lawyer a different definition of neighborhood, one that goes beyond the bare minimum of what's required by the religious law. And Jesus does this by telling him the story of a man walking from Jerusalem to Jericho. The Jericho road is 17 miles long. It's completely rugged terrain. It's downhill most of the way, which makes the trek physically grueling, especially on the knees. And what's more, it's also a road that's known to attract unsavory types of people, bandits, who know that the folks walking this path are likely laden with items and gifts from the big city of Jerusalem to take to those they plan to visit in the small town of Jericho. And unfortunately, the man who's walking the Jericho road in this story becomes a victim of a vicious robbery. He's beaten, stripped naked, and left for dead at the side of the road. And not long afterwards, here come 2 religious leaders down that same road, first a priest and then a Levite. Both of them see this man and choose to pass on the other side of the road. They look away from him and they hurry by perhaps afraid that they're also in danger of getting robbed. They aren't just ignoring the situation, averting their eyes or pretending he's not there. I think they see him, but they're scared for their own safety. Or perhaps he looks dead and they don't know that their help would really help. They don't know what to do in this dangerous and isolating place. If they choose to stop and help the man, could their actions really even save him? Maybe the situation looked hopeless, and they weren't about to put themselves in danger for a lost cause. Whatever the reason, these two religious folks walk on by, hurrying past the man on the side of the road. But Jesus then shocks his audience by making the third passerby a Samaritan. Now, Samaritans may not sound bad to us, but they were the most hated outgroup of the Jewish community at the time. They worshiped Yahweh, which was the same God as their Jewish cousins, but they didn't follow all the proper laws and customs. And Samaritans' religious rituals were a mix of Judaism and paganism that was pretty anathema to the Jews at the time. This didn't sit well with the more devout followers, who considered Samaritans the worst kind of hypocrites. And for this reason, the lawyer and the other followers gathered around Jesus that day would have curdled even at the mention of a Samaritan in the story. But the Samaritan winds up being the unlikely hero of Jesus' parable. Not only does the Samaritan bandage the injured man, he also takes him to safety. He drops him at an inn to heal and to rest, and he promises the innkeeper any money it would take to shelter the man as long as he heals. Now, have you ever gotten a hospital bill? Imagine taking a person to a hospital and saying, you know what, it's on me. Do whatever is needed to make this man well and charge it to me. This is a radical act of care and hospitality, especially for a total stranger. So this Good Samaritan's behavior makes this a simple morality tale, right? Jesus' parable is supposed to inspire his listeners, and therefore us, to go and do likewise, to go and find ways to show outstanding compassion to others. And so that's the first sermon that I wrote you this week. The expected, the safe sermon. The punchline of that sermon was, and I quote, "We shouldn't, like the lawyer, try to figure out the limits of our responsibility to our neighbors, but the extent of our opportunity to help." Not a bad little nugget, right? A little nugget you can put in your church doggy bag and nosh on a little bit later in the afternoon. But then the week progressed. The news cycle, in its inevitable way, reminded me that that tasty little religious morsel isn't enough. That a sermon about who is my neighbor in these days mustn't stop at the bare minimum of go out and be good to others that you meet that are in need. And I felt my heart convicted that the Good Samaritan story had more to tell us today. Something to speak to the cruelty of what's happening at our borders. Who is my neighbor? Something to speak to the spitefulness of crowds shouting, "Send her back," to a duly elected Muslim congresswoman because of her compassion for those seeking asylum in our country. Who is my neighbor? Something to speak to the callousness of colonizing governments whose decades of oppression have sparked such righteous outrage in the people of Puerto Rico and Hawaii, defending their cultures and their sacred places. Yes, Jesus, I ask you, who is my neighbor? To truly get to root of the message of Jesus in today's parable, we have to realize just how radical it was, and then hope that this radical message would inspire us beyond everyday kindnesses, beyond just doing good for those that we see. Like the priest and the Levite, we of course notice all these things happening around us, bodies metaphorically and literally on the side of the road, labeled illegal, put into cages, or easily ignored because their protests don't really have anything to do with us personally, right? Our hearts go out to them, and we change the channel or swipe up to the next story. Of course we'd go the extra mile. We'd be the Good Samaritan if we could, but how can we even help? Would anything we do matter? And in an age of creeping totalitarianism, would our help perhaps even put us and our communities in danger? Just where are we on the Jericho road? Beloved community, we miss something in the story if all we're ever trying to be is the Good Samaritan. In this day and age, I'm afraid it's no longer enough, because the Good Samaritan, you see, has the privilege of being a person in the story who is standing upright, who has enough resources to help, and who gets to decide whether or not to do so. That is the privilege of every Good Samaritan, and it's not good enough. The Good Samaritan gets to help or not help, gets to do her bit of good and then walk away on down the road to take care of her initial business in the first place. But the man lying in the ditch is completely vulnerable, completely unable to change his situation and is in need of someone, anyone to help. Maybe you share with me the numbness that I feel when I turn on the news. Maybe you share with me the feeling of impotence to do anything at all to contribute to the peace, or to stand in solidarity with those being held in cages or protesting colonizing forces in their lands. And so I ask, just as the lawyer did, who is my neighbor and what am I supposed to do? And if I'm being honest with myself, I'm asking just like he did, because I'm trying to find the limits of my responsibility, just how little I need to do to feel like it's enough. And I'm forgetting that Jesus always points me instead to the extent of my opportunity to help, not as a point of guilt or shame if I don't do enough, but as a way of encouraging me to reach beyond myself to deeper empathy, to deeper compassion for this world. I've given it a lot of thought, and I'm still struggling. But I think the key to help making a real difference starts with no longer identifying with the Good Samaritan, with no longer allowing myself even the choice of walking away, until I identify with the fear and the anger and the vulnerability of the one lying in the ditch, the one who was robbed. Being the one all alone and seemingly forgotten, I will always be able to walk away until I can be the one imagining taking my 4-year-old daughter from my arms, until I can imagine breathing tear gas because I love my Borican people enough to put my body on the line for them, until I can imagine chaining myself to the sacred mountain to avoid its exploitation. I will never have enough empathy to truly make a difference. I will always have the choice to use my privilege and walk away. Those of you in this room who know me know that I often complain that my life is too busy. I'm pulled in 10 different directions by the demands of work, ministry, family, and my social life. And I have it pretty good. So it's a pretty paltry complaint. But still, there's this sense that I just don't have the time I need. And it's a pervasive excuse I give myself to not do the justice work that I should. But what if I got in a car wreck? Or had a sudden debilitating illness? Everything I did in my life would shift onto this new priority of making myself well, right? Things that currently take up worried space in my brain would fall to the wayside as other more pressing concerns took precedent. It would be easy for me to find the time to prioritize my healing. And that realization is why I need to identify with the man at the side of the road. Because if he is lying there, I am lying there. And it's up to me to prioritize our common healing. In this way, my empathy will become more than just an afterthought. It will become a necessity. That kind of empathy, that's what Jesus' parable is asking of his followers this morning. The kind of empathy that doesn't allow us to look away, but feels the sickness of the world as our own, in our bones, and in our hearts. This week, with all the scary and bad news swirling, you may have missed a pretty great civil disobedience act that happened in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday afternoon. At least 1,000 people gathered to protest outside of ICE headquarters, shutting down all points of entry for several hours. The event was organized by a group called Never Again Action, which is a Jewish activist group that's been protesting outside of ICE facilities across the U.S. Never Again Action was formed by leaders who were taught in their synagogues that it's their duty as people whose families endured the Holocaust to never let concentration camps happen again. And so, their mission is to peacefully disrupt ICE's daily work through this kind of protest. These activists have the kind of empathy I'm talking about, right? The kind of empathy born from their own experience, the kind of empathy that they feel in their own bones, the kind of empathy that does not let them look away. And my prayer for all of us this morning is that we might use our bodies to make a difference however we can. Let us add our lives to the struggle at our border by donating to groups like Never Again Action or Movimiento Cosecha, which is an organization that provides legal support for undocumented immigrants. But also remember, there are 200 detention centers in this country, including those in Massachusetts, and there are protests daily. Let us add our lives to the struggle for racial justice by calling out racist behavior, not laughing at racist jokes, or going one step further to say, I don't tolerate that kind of language in my presence. Let us add our bodies to the struggle by clasping our hands together, whether in prayer or around a protest sign. Let us resist in whatever way we can, knowing that it is a holy and sacred act to do so. Who is my neighbor? I am my neighbor. And it's my responsibility to stay in the ditch and never turn or walk away until the day when no one lies alone and bleeding in the street. May it be so.